When J.R.R. Tolkien published The Lord of the Rings in the mid-1950s, he could not have foreseen how monumental its reception would be in the decades to follow. He had spent more than a decade crafting a story that was not simply a novel but a mythological structure for an imagined world, a deep lore that included languages, lineages, maps, histories, and songs. The story of Frodo, Gandalf, Aragorn, and the struggle against Sauron was, in the eyes of readers, a complete saga that closed with both triumph and melancholy. Yet for Tolkien, the world he had created was never truly finished. The professor of philology and creator of Middle-earth often found himself driven by the need to explore further, to ask what came next, and to document not only the past ages of his world but also its future. This impulse eventually led him to sketch and begin work on a sequel to The Lord of the Rings, a continuation set in the Fourth Age of Middle-earth. However, this project, which he tentatively titled The New Shadow, was ultimately abandoned after only a few chapters, leaving behind fragments that reveal both Tolkien's creative restlessness and his dissatisfaction with the path the story seemed to take. The fact that Tolkien even considered writing a sequel is fascinating in itself, since he often expressed his desire to move back in time rather than forward. Most of his post-Lord of the Rings writings returned to earlier epics, refining the great tales of the Silmarillion, developing narratives of the First and Second Ages, and reconstructing ancient mythologies that predated the War of the Ring. Yet at some point, probably around the late 1950s, after The Lord of the Rings had been published and his readers clamored for more, he turned his imagination forward to the world after the fall of Sauron. The question was simple but powerful: what happens when the great evil is defeated? What does peace look like in Middle-earth, and how long does it last? Tolkien began sketching answers to this question, but his exploration led him into territory that left him dissatisfied, to the point that he set aside the work and declared it unworthy of further pursuit. The surviving drafts of The New Shadow reveal a grim vision. The story is set about a century after the fall of Sauron, during the reign of Aragorn's son Eldarion. The peace and prosperity of Gondor are well established, but beneath the surface a rot begins to spread. Discontent grows among younger generations who never experienced the darkness of the past wars. Without Sauron, without orcs marching from Mordor, without Nazgul to terrorize the land, the youth of Gondor begin to find excitement in darker pursuits. Tolkien envisioned that a kind of secret cult would rise, with boys playing at being orcs, performing sinister rituals, and gradually reviving a shadow that threatened the stability of the realm. It was not a great cosmic struggle against a dark lord, but something subtler and perhaps more insidious: the moral decline of a society at peace. At the center of this vision was a character named Borlaz, the son of Beregond, who had been a loyal soldier in Minas Tirith during the War of the Ring. Borlaz, now an old man, represents memory of the past, someone who recalls the darkness and understands the price of peace. In the fragments Tolkien wrote, Borlaz encounters a younger character named Ceylon, who tempts him with talk of a growing movement that plays with shadows, hinting at rebellion and corruption. The tone is immediately sinister, with Tolkien describing an atmosphere of unease, the sense that beneath the surface of Gondor's order lurks a new kind of decay. Unlike The Lord of the Rings, which builds toward epic battles and the fate of the world, The New Shadow begins with secrecy, suspicion, and a society turning inward against itself. Tolkien himself described this project as a thriller, of sorts, but he quickly realized that he did not find it compelling. In letters written to his readers, he explained that while the seeds of evil always remained in humanity, and while it was true that Shadow could rise again, he did not believe the story would capture the same grandeur or necessity as The Lord of the Rings. Evil, he suggested, was never wholly vanquished, but it was also rarely embodied again in such a dramatic form as Sauron. Instead, the corruption of men, their petty grievances, their lust for power, would erode societies from within. This, Tolkien realized, was too much like the real world, too mundane, too close to the kinds of struggles that human beings actually face day to day. For him, Middle-earth was supposed to be a mythological mirror of our world, but not a literal reflection. To write a tale about conspiracies, secret cults, and declining morality was to drift away from myth and toward something that felt like modern political allegory, which he disliked. One of Tolkien's deepest concerns was that a sequel would diminish the power of The Lord of the Rings. He was acutely aware that stories can be weakened when continuations do not live up to the original, and he did not want to force a tale that he himself found uninspiring. In his letters, he mentioned that the new shadow would likely span only a few chapters before collapsing into a tale of old men grumbling, and young men misbehaving, without any true epic purpose. He abandoned it after writing about 13 pages, recognizing that his heart was not in it. That abandonment is telling, because Tolkien was not a writer who shied away from unfinished tales. Many of his works, including most of the Silmarillion, remained incomplete at his death, but in those cases he left extensive drafts and notes. The new shadow, by contrast, was halted at its very beginning, almost as though he sensed immediately that it was a path he should not take. What makes the new shadow so intriguing, however, is the way it reflects Tolkien's understanding of history and human nature. He was deeply influenced by cyclical views of history, the idea that peace is always temporary, that evil may be beaten back but never eliminated, that human beings are prone to fall again and again. The Lord of the Rings ends with victory, but also with Frodo's departure into the West, symbolizing that scars remain even when evil is defeated. The new shadow takes this idea further, showing that even a century later, when all seems well, corruption stirs again. It is a bleak but realistic vision. No age of man is free from decay. Perhaps Tolkien abandoned the story because it was too true, too reflective of the modern world he lived in, where post-war optimism gave way to Cold War tensions, where the memory of great struggles was already fading as new generations took peace for granted. Another reason Tolkien likely gave up on the sequel is that he always saw The Lord of the Rings not as an isolated novel but as part of his larger legendarium. The story of the War of the Ring was already a sequel in itself, a continuation of the histories of the Silmarillion. For Tolkien, the most compelling part of his mythology lay in the ancient past, in the great struggles against Morgoth in the First Age, or the forging of the Rings of Power in the Second Age. These were mythic, epic tales that suited his grand imagination. Moving forward into the Fourth Age meant leaving behind elves, wizards, and the mythological dimension that gave Middle-earth its resonance. The new shadow would be a story about men alone, about politics and corruption, about human weakness without the counterbalance of the mythic. Tolkien may have felt that such a tale belonged more to the modern novel than to his mythic cycle, and thus it did not fit the purpose for which he wrote. In the years following the abandonment of the new shadow, Tolkien returned to revising the Silmarillion and developing further appendices to The Lord of the Rings. He refined genealogies, histories, and languages, but he never again tried to move forward into the distant future of Middle-earth. This decision preserved the sense of closure that The Lord of the Rings provides. Readers are left with the impression of a world that continues, but whose greatest story has already been told. The curtain falls at the right moment, leaving us with both satisfaction and wistfulness. In a way, Tolkien's refusal to force a sequel may have been one of the wisest choices he made as an author, allowing his magnum opus to stand alone without dilution. The surviving pages of The New Shadow remain a tantalizing glimpse into what might have been. They show us a Gondor in peace but uneasy, a society wrestling with the same shadows that haunt every human civilization. They show us Tolkien grappling with the question of how to write about evil in an age without a Dark Lord. They remind us that even the greatest storytellers struggle with the limits of their creations. And they reveal, above all, Tolkien's artistic integrity. He would rather abandon a story than publish one he believed did not serve his vision. Today, The New Shadow is often discussed among Tolkien enthusiasts as one of the great what-ifs of fantasy literature. Would it have been received with the same adoration as The Lord of the Rings? Almost certainly not, for Tolkien himself doubted it. But its very existence, even in fragmentary form, enriches our understanding of Middle-earth. It underscores the idea that Middle-earth was not simply a backdrop for one adventure but a living, breathing world, with a history that extended endlessly forward and backward. It shows us Tolkien's restless creativity, his unwillingness to let his world stand still. And it reminds us that even in peace, even in the supposed Golden Age, shadows linger at the edges. In the end, the story of why J.R.R. Tolkien abandoned his Lord of the Rings sequel is as much about his philosophy of storytelling as it is about the narrative itself. He believed in myth, in the power of stories to capture truths that go beyond the everyday. The new shadow threatened to reduce his myth into a tale of petty politics and discontent. That was not the Middle-earth he wanted to give to his readers. By walking away, he preserved the mythic quality of his world, leaving us with a legend that feels complete even as it leaves us longing for more. The abandonment of the new shadow is also a reminder of the difficulty of writing sequels to great works. For many authors, the temptation to continue is irresistible, driven by demand or curiosity. But sequels often struggle to match the resonance of their predecessors, and Tolkien, with his deep awareness of literary tradition, recognized this risk. His decision to leave Middle-earth's future largely unwritten was not only an act of personal dissatisfaction but also an act of protection for his masterpiece. He chose silence over compromise, leaving space for imagination rather than filling it with a story that did not satisfy him. To read the fragment of the new shadow today is to experience both excitement and relief. Excitement at seeing a glimpse of what could have been, relief that Tolkien left us with a legend unspoiled by a continuation that he himself distrusted. It is a fragment that makes us think about the nature of evil, the fragility of peace, and the way societies forget the past. It is also a fragment that shows us Tolkien's humility as an artist, willing to set aside his work rather than pretend it met his standards. In this, perhaps, there is a lesson for all writers. Sometimes the greatest act of storytelling is knowing when not to tell a story. And so, the tale of the new shadow remains unfinished, a shadow itself on the edges of Middle-earth's lore. It whispers to us of cults and corruption, of Borlas and Ceylon, of a Gondor uneasy in its peace. It shows us the restlessness of Tolkien's imagination and the rigor of his judgment. Most of all, it reminds us that Middle-earth, like our own world, is never free from the shadow, but that not every shadow must be followed into story. Sometimes, leaving the darkness unspoken is the most powerful choice of all. 1. Tolkien briefly attempted a sequel to The Lord of the Rings called The New Shadow, set in the Fourth Age. When Tolkien completed The Lord of the Rings, he had already dedicated over a decade of his life to shaping the epic tale of Frodo, Gandalf, and the struggle against Sauron. Readers across the world fell in love with the story and naturally wanted to know what came next in Middle-earth. Tolkien himself, however, was cautious. He often described his works as fragments of a much larger myth, and he preferred to explore the ancient histories of his world rather than move forward in time. Yet, curiosity, and perhaps reader demand, led him to attempt a sequel. The New Shadow was his answer, though only in its earliest beginnings. It was an experiment in asking, what comes after peace? The story was set in Gondor roughly a century after the War of the Ring, offering a darker, subtler reflection on the endurance of evil in human hearts. 2. The story took place about 100 years after Sauron's fall, during the reign of Aragorn's son Eldarion. Unlike The Lord of the Rings, which focused on the dramatic collapse of Sauron's empire and the restoration of Aragorn to Gondor's throne, The New Shadow jumped forward into the era of Aragorn's successor, his son Eldarion. By this point in history, Gondor was stable and prosperous. Eldarion inherited a kingdom unified by peace and seemingly free from external enemies. However, Tolkien's choice of setting, a full century after the Great Victory, was significant. By placing the story far enough into the future, he was able to explore how subsequent generations who never lived through the terror of Mordor might take peace for granted. The central question was whether Gondor's glory would endure, or if human weakness would allow corruption to creep back in. The result was a story that aimed not at external wars, but at the internal erosion of values in a time of stability. 3. Tolkien's focus was not on external threats like orcs or dark lords but on the moral decay of men. In The Lord of the Rings, evil is personified by Sauron, the Ringwraiths, and the orcs who march under his banner. The danger is visible, external, and overwhelming. But Tolkien's vision for The New Shadow was different. Here, the threat was not some new dark lord emerging to enslave Middle-earth but the slow and subtle decay within men themselves. He wanted to show how peace and prosperity, while celebrated, often breed complacency and corruption. When the terror of the past fades into memory, people forget its lessons. Thus, evil reappears not as armies at the gates but as suspicion, conspiracy, and the seduction of darker impulses. Tolkien's idea was to capture the fragility of human morality. In this sense, the story echoed real-world patterns of history. when societies flourish, internal strife and corruption can rise to undo what was hard won by earlier generations. 4. The youth of Gondor, having grown up in peace, became restless and toyed with darkness for excitement. A key theme in The New Shadow was Tolkien's observation that peace often leads to boredom for younger generations who did not endure the struggles of the past. The youth of Gondor, in his draft, had never seen war, never faced true peril, and had only inherited a world of order and comfort. In such a setting, some began to seek thrills by rebelling against societal norms. Tolkien hinted that children and teenagers would play dangerous games, pretending to be orcs, mimicking the brutality of the past without understanding its true horror. What began as play could evolve into dangerous fascination, leading to the revival of sinister cults. This reflection was deeply rooted in Tolkien's own experiences of the 20th century, where he saw younger generations sometimes romanticizing violence or revolution without knowing the devastation of world wars. He was warning that memory fades, and with it, vigilance. 5. Tolkien envisioned secret cults forming, where boys pretended to be orcs and played with sinister rituals. The imagery of children playing at being orcs was particularly haunting in Tolkien's unfinished sequel. For him, it symbolized a dangerous fascination with darkness. These boys were not villains in the traditional sense, they were curious, reckless, and rebellious, much like discontented youths in any age. But their games hinted at something larger, the revival of forbidden practices and sinister rituals. Tolkien envisioned the rise of secret societies in Gondor, clandestine gatherings where disillusioned individuals, seeking power or purpose, would flirt with evil. Unlike Sauron's domination, which was a vast cosmic struggle, these cults represented evil creeping back in through the cracks of human weakness. They may not have conjured armies of orcs, but they undermined the moral foundation of society from within. Tolkien's choice to explore cult-like behavior made the story darker, more psychological, and perhaps too uncomfortably close to modern realities. 6. The central character was Borlaz, son of Beregond, an old man who remembered the War of the Ring. Borlaz was to be the anchor of Tolkien's story, a figure who carried living memory of the great struggles of the past. He was the son of Beregond, a soldier of Gondor who had been loyal to Faramir and played a role in saving Minas Tirith during the War of the Ring. In The New Shadow, Borlaz appears as an elderly man, weary but wise, representing the link between the past and the present. Tolkien used Borlaz as a contrast to the restless youth who had never experienced true darkness. Through Borlaz, the story could reflect on themes of memory, vigilance, and the dangers of forgetting history's lessons. He was a man haunted by the knowledge that evil, though defeated, is never gone. By choosing Borlaz as his protagonist, Tolkien emphasized continuity, showing how the older generation tried to warn the new, often in vain. 7. Borlaz is drawn into conversations with a younger man, Ceylon, hinting at corruption spreading in Gondor. In the fragments Tolkien left, Borlaz engages in tense conversations with a younger character named Ceylon. Their exchanges are filled with unease, with Ceylon hinting at the existence of underground movements and growing discontent in Gondor. Through Ceylon, Tolkien began to introduce the subtle menace at the heart of the story, ordinary men being tempted by secrecy, rebellion, and fascination with the forbidden. Ceylon tempts Borlaz, speaking of activities that sound more like conspiracies than childish games, suggesting that something darker lurks beneath the surface. These conversations set the tone for the story as a thriller, building suspense around hidden corruption rather than external war. The contrast between Borlaz, who remembers the shadow, and Ceylon, who embraces new shadows, reflects Tolkien's exploration of generational change. The old warn of dangers, but the young, unscarred by the past, too easily dismiss them. 8. The narrative began with suspense and conspiracy rather than epic battles or quests. Whereas The Lord of the Rings begins with the discovery of the ring and slowly builds toward journeys, armies, and massive battles, The New Shadow begins much smaller, almost like a mystery novel. The tension is rooted in suspicion, hushed conversations, and hints of conspiracy. Tolkien envisioned it as a story where evil operates not from grand towers or battlefields but from within neighborhoods, friendships, and the everyday life of Gondor. This was a departure from the mythic scope of his earlier work and leaned more toward a modern thriller. The danger was invisible, subtle, and psychological, making the story much less about high fantasy and more about human behavior. Tolkien quickly realized this tone, while intriguing, did not fit his vision for Middle-earth. It lacked the sweeping mythic quality that made his world resonate as legend rather than mere fiction. 9. Tolkien described the concept as more of a political thriller than a mythic epic. In his letters, Tolkien admitted that what he was writing in The New Shadow felt more like a political thriller than a mythological continuation. Instead of grand quests or cosmic evil, the story was concerned with hidden cults, corruption, and unrest in Gondor. The narrative direction leaned toward the mechanics of power and rebellion, something more aligned with espionage novels than with high fantasy. For Tolkien, who devoted his life to creating myth, this was a serious problem. He did not want Middle-earth to descend into the realm of ordinary politics. He saw his work as an effort to create legendarium, timeless myths for England, and this sequel did not fit that mold. The political thriller aspect intrigued him briefly, but he recognized quickly that it was not the kind of story his world demanded. Thus, his dissatisfaction grew, leading to abandonment. 10. He soon realized the story lacked grandeur and admitted it would devolve into old men grumbling. Tolkien himself described The New Shadow as a story that would end up being old men grumbling about the state of society. This was his way of expressing his disappointment with the narrative scope. Instead of offering the mythic resonance of battles between light and darkness, it seemed destined to become a tale of complaints, suspicions, and petty discontent. For a writer who had created some of the most sweeping and epic scenes in literature, the fall of Sauron, the battles of Helm's Deep and Pelennor Fields, this was uninspiring. He could not muster the passion to develop a story that, in his own words, lacked any true theme or purpose. This recognition shows Tolkien's honesty as a writer. Rather than force a story forward for the sake of continuation, he allowed it to wither, protecting the grandeur of his existing work. 11. In his letters, Tolkien explained that evil never vanishes but resurfaces in mundane, subtle forms. A recurring idea in Tolkien's writings, both published and personal, is that evil cannot be permanently defeated. Morgoth was banished, Sauron destroyed, yet Tolkien believed darkness always lurked in the hearts of men. He explained that evil often reappears in subtler, less mythic forms: greed, corruption, discontent, and betrayal. The New Shadow was his attempt to explore this truth in Middle-earth. But while it was philosophically accurate, he found it artistically unsatisfying. A story about mundane corruption felt too ordinary to justify itself as part of his great legendarium. Tolkien's insight, however, remains powerful. The fragility of peace, the way human beings allow evil to creep back in small, everyday ways, resonates strongly with history. The tragedy was that this truth, while important, did not translate into the mythic kind of story Tolkien wanted to tell. Thus, he shelved the project. 12. He worried that this kind of story would feel too much like real-world politics, which he disliked in his myth. Tolkien was famously resistant to allegory. He disliked when readers tried to map his stories directly onto modern political events or ideologies. In his view, mythology should convey universal truths, not serve as commentary on specific governments, wars, or ideologies. The New Shadow, however, risked becoming too much like a reflection of contemporary politics. Secret cults, declining morality, and rebellious youth could easily be read as commentary on mid-20th century society. Tolkien did not want his mythology to become a thin disguise for current affairs. For him, Middle-earth was valuable precisely because it operated outside of specific politics, instead reaching toward timeless myth. This concern deepened his dissatisfaction with the sequel. He realized that continuing forward into the Fourth Age would inevitably feel like a critique of modern life rather than a timeless tale, and he did not want Middle-earth reduced to political allegory. 13. Tolkien believed The Lord of the Rings had already reached a natural, satisfying conclusion. One of the reasons Tolkien abandoned his sequel was his recognition that The Lord of the Rings already provided closure. The ring was destroyed, Sauron defeated, Aragorn crowned, and the Age of Men begun. Frodo's departure to the west was bittersweet, but it symbolized healing and the end of an age. For Tolkien, this was the right moment to let the curtain fall. Any attempt to continue risked disrupting that sense of finality. He knew that true myth should end with resonance, not repetition. Readers might crave more, but an artist must know when enough has been said. His reluctance to weaken the impact of his masterpiece shows his artistic discipline. Tolkien's decision to stop with The Lord of the Rings allowed the story to remain complete and satisfying, without the need for forced continuation that could undermine its mythic power. 14. A sequel risked diminishing the power and resonance of the original tale. Tolkien understood the dangers of sequels. Many great stories lose their impact when follow-ups fail to capture the magic of the original. He feared that the new Shadow, with its focus on conspiracies and moral decay, would not stand beside The Lord of the Rings as an equal but instead tarnish its legacy. The epic grandeur of the struggle against Sauron could not be matched by tales of young men misbehaving in Gondor. For Tolkien, whose entire purpose was to create legend, this was unacceptable. By abandoning the sequel, he avoided weakening the mythic resonance of his greatest work. His decision demonstrates humility. He would rather leave readers wanting more than give them a disappointing continuation. In this way, Tolkien preserved the singular majesty of The Lord of the Rings, allowing it to remain one of the greatest epics ever told. 15. Unlike his mythic stories of the First and Second Ages, this sequel lacked elves, wizards, and cosmic stakes. Another problem Tolkien identified with The New Shadow was that, in the Fourth Age, most of the mythic elements of Middle-earth had already faded. The elves were departing across the sea, the wizards were gone, and Sauron was destroyed. What remained was an age of men. For Tolkien, this stripped away much of the mythological dimension that gave his stories their resonance. Without elves or wizards, the tale became more like a historical novel about human politics rather than a myth. The absence of cosmic stakes, the fate of the world, the battle between light and darkness, made the story feel small in comparison to its predecessor. Tolkien may have realized that the Fourth Age simply was not fertile ground for the kind of myth he wanted to tell. His imagination gravitated toward earlier ages, where the mythic flourished. 16. He abandoned the project after only about 13 pages, never returning to it again. Unlike many of his unfinished tales, which survive in vast collections of notes, outlines, and multiple drafts, The New Shadow barely began. Tolkien stopped after about 13 pages, a mere fragment compared to his sprawling mythology. This abrupt halt reveals how quickly he realized the story was not working. He did not even attempt to outline its full scope, indicating his lack of conviction. In later letters, he spoke openly of his dissatisfaction and confirmed that he had no intention of continuing. For readers, the existence of those 13 pages is tantalizing, a glimpse into what might have been, but also a reminder of Tolkien's high standards. He would not pursue a story he felt unworthy of his legendarium. His refusal to force it demonstrates both his honesty as a writer and his commitment to preserving the integrity of Middle-earth. 17. The surviving fragment reveals Tolkien's cyclical view of history: peace always decays, evil always returns. Even in its short form, The New Shadow conveys one of Tolkien's most important philosophical ideas, that history is cyclical. Victories bring peace, but peace breeds complacency, which in turn allows evil to rise again. He saw this pattern in the real world and embedded it in his mythology. Morgoth fell, but Sauron arose. Sauron was destroyed, but human corruption would return. The fragment shows Borlas, an old man, recognizing this truth, while the youth around him fall into dangerous games. This cyclical vision adds depth to Middle-earth, showing that no victory is permanent. While Tolkien abandoned the story, the idea it explored still enriches our understanding of his world. The New Shadow reminds us that even after the most glorious triumph, darkness waits in the wings, ready to return when vigilance fades. 18. The story may have been abandoned because it was too bleak and too reflective of the modern world. Tolkien lived through both world wars and witnessed the fragility of peace firsthand. He knew how easily societies could slide into darkness once the memory of struggle faded. In this sense, The New Shadow was deeply rooted in his experience of the 20th century. But perhaps it was too close, too bleak, and too realistic. Unlike his mythic tales that transcended time, this story seemed like a mirror of modern discontent. Tolkien may have recoiled from that. He wanted Middle-earth to reflect truths without becoming a direct allegory for current events. The New Shadow, however, risked being read as a commentary on his own society. Its bleakness, the idea that even a century after victory, evil resurfaces in petty cults, may have discouraged him. Tolkien wanted myth to inspire, not merely to echo the grim cycles of modern history. 19. By refusing to force a sequel, Tolkien preserved the mythic integrity of Middle-earth. Tolkien's decision not to continue The New Shadow ultimately protected the legacy of his work. Middle-earth remained a mythic world defined by great struggles between light and darkness, not by small conspiracies or political intrigues. His refusal showed that he valued the integrity of his mythology more than the demands of fans or publishers. This restraint is rare among authors, many of whom continue stories long past their natural conclusion. By stopping, Tolkien left Middle-earth complete, resonant, and undiluted. The absence of a sequel allowed The Lord of the Rings to remain the definitive closing chapter of his saga. Readers were left with longing, but also with the sense that the story had ended where it should. In preserving his legendarium from a weaker sequel, Tolkien demonstrated both artistic discipline and a deep respect for his creation. 20. The unfinished New Shadow remains a fascinating what-if that reveals Tolkien's artistic discipline and vision. Though only a fragment, The New Shadow continues to fascinate readers and scholars. It is one of the great what-ifs of fantasy literature. What if Tolkien had finished it? What would Middle-earth look like in a tale without elves, wizards, or great battles? We will never know, because Tolkien chose to abandon it. And in that choice, we glimpse his discipline as an artist. He was unwilling to compromise his vision, unwilling to write a story that did not align with the mythic purpose of his legendarium. The existence of the fragment enriches our appreciation of Tolkien's work, showing us both his creative restlessness and his refusal to settle for less. It stands as a reminder